Hi everyone and welcome to my channel. So this is the sewing video on how I made this dress. Now I've gone ahead to cut out all the patterns. This is the front part, and as you all can see, I went ahead to add half an inch on all the sides and on the top part of the front. Now for attaching the neckline, I will start by sewing the allowance I added before attaching it to the dart line. For the front, I use a chantilly lace, a crepe fabric and a lining. And for the neckline, I also use a chantilly lace, and I'll be using a crepe lining for both the main material and for the lining. So this is our jacket, and I just added an allowance on the top part of the cuff, and I went ahead to cut out a lining for it as well. As for the back, I've gone ahead to cut it out, and I did not cut out my dart on the back. Now for the sleeve, this is just a basic long sleeve, but on the down part of the sleeve, I came in by 2 inches and then I came up by 7 inches. I connected the points together and cut it out. So on this cut out part, I'm going to be adding a flare. This flare is a 90-degree flare, which is also 7 inches long and 5 inches wide, and then I'll just connect it like so. So for the skirt, I started by drafting my starting line, and then I marked my hip point, the thigh point and my length of the skirt together with 2 inches allowance. So I went ahead to mark it again and just connected the lines together. Now after connecting the lines, I went ahead to mark out the various measurements. On the waist, I marked my measurements plus 1.5 inch sewing allowance. The same thing I did for the hip. On the thigh, I marked out the thigh measurement plus 1 inch allowance. The same thing on the thigh, I marked on the end of the skirt, and then I went ahead to cut it out. Now on the top of the skirt, I just came up by half an inch joining allowance, and then I went ahead to cut it out. After drafting the skirt, I opened it up, and now it's time for us to draft the slanty parts. Now remember this paper that I told you all to keep aside for drafting the skirt. So this is what we are going to use to trace out the slanted line on the skirt. So it is very necessary to be sure of where the slanted design is going to be before drafting this out, because here I made a mistake and drafted it on the wrong part, but luckily for me I realized it before cutting out my skirt. So here I'm just labeling the skirt to be sure which side is the right and which side is the left. After labeling it, I went ahead to retrace the slanted design on the skirts. Now after retracing it, I just went ahead to cut out the unwanted part, and that is it for our skirt. Now let's start sewing. So first I started by removing the lining from the actual fabric. I turned it over to the wrong side, and after turning it over, I went ahead to arrange it and then to place my padded on the fabric. So while placing the padded, you have to be sure that everything aligns. Like the underbust of the padded should be on the underbust of the dress, and this way you would actually get a perfect padded. Now if you want a video on padded, I'm actually working on that and I'm going to drop that very soon. So after placing your padded, it's advisable to actually iron it before sewing, not after sewing. This would actually help your padded to sit perfectly. Now after ironing, you will just go ahead to sew it down and do the same thing for the lining. Now for the neckline, I use the lining part to cover the main fabric, sew it up and turn it over. Now as you all can see, I've sewn my bustier, and on the allowance line, I went ahead to trim any excess padded so that my padded can actually come out nicely. As you all can see, it came out nicely. Now the next thing I went ahead to do was to arrange my neckline so that it will be on the same line as the darts. After placing it, it's time for us to turn it over or to sew it down. So to sew it down, we'll bring our lining, place it right sides facing each other with the main fabric. After placing it, we'll go ahead and sew it on the chest line with ½ inch sewing allowance. Now I've gone ahead to sew it down. Next thing I went ahead to do was to turn this over, and then I shifted the sewing allowance to the lining side, and then I'm going to sew the sewing allowance down. Now for our jacket, initially, if you all can see again from the picture, from our inspiration, there was a lace design on this jacket part. So I wanted to place this lace design before turning it with a lining, but I decided to turn it over first before placing the lining. Now after turning the jacket, I went ahead to place it on the bustier so that every part of it aligns with the bustier. And after placing it, I'll just go ahead and sew on this upper part of the curve. While sewing, I turned the lining over to the side so that I would not sew on the lining. So now I'm done attaching the jacket to the bustier, and next thing I'm going to do is to also attach this lace design on that same curved line. So while sewing as well, we'll make sure not to sew on the lining because we'll need the lining to turn the whole dress together. So I'm done attaching this lace, this strip of lace, and as you all can see, I did not sew on the lining. After I was done, I went ahead to remove any pin that I used to hold the jacket part in place. And when I was done removing the pin, it's time for us to attach our skirt. Now to attach the skirt, we'll just find the midpoint of the skirt and notch it. We'll also find the midpoint of our bustier and notch it. We'll do the same thing for the lining part of the bustier and for the lining part of the skirt. Now after notching, we'll place both notches together and sew them down. And we would also do the same thing to the main fabric. Now we're done sewing, and as you all can see, it's neatly sewn, and we did the same thing for the lining as well. Now after that, the next thing we're going to do is to turn it over to the wrong side, and after turning it over, we'll start by sewing the down part of the dress, and after sewing it down, we'll go ahead and sew both sides, and we would also leave a little bit of space just to turn it over to the right side. So this is the space that I left, and after turning it over to the right, I'll just go ahead and close it back. So we're done with the front, and we'll just keep that aside. Now for the back, as you all can see, we did not cut out any darts. So to take in our darts, we're going to trace the darts on the actual fabric and then sew it down. So I came in from the zip allowance side by the nipple to nipple measurement. I went up to the chest point and then I just marked out the darts. So while sewing, I'll just go ahead and sew it straight up to the chest line. Now I'm done sewing the darts, as you all can see. And now it's time for us to attach our skirts. So just like we did for the front, I went ahead to locate the midpoint of the back and then I notched it. As for the skirt part of the back, I also located the midpoint and notched it as well. After notching it, I'll go ahead and connect both notches together and sew it down. So I'll do the same thing for the lining. Now I have sewn it down and this is what we have. Next thing we are going to do is to turn the neckline, to sew on the neckline, placing both right sides together, and after that we'll sew on the down part of the back. After sewing on the down, we'll just go ahead and sew on both sides. So I've sewn them down and I went ahead to turn it over to the right side, leaving a space on the shoulder line, on the shoulder side. So after turning it over, it's time for us to attach our zip. But before attaching our zip, on the parts below the zip where we're not going to attach any zip, we'll come out by our sewing allowance and then we'll just like trace it down to where our slit started. So here I started 8 inches below my waistline. 8 inches is like 1 inch above my hip line, and from there I connected it to the point where my slit started. So I've sewn this down and the next thing I went ahead to do was to connect my zip. So I've attached my zip and the next thing I went ahead to do was to attach both shoulders together. I used the shoulder of the back to wrap the shoulder of the front and then I sewed it down. So this is the finishing after attaching. So on the shoulder of the jacket part, you will notice that the shoulder on the jacket is a bit longer than the bustier shoulder that it is attached to, but it is totally fine as long as they are sewn together. Now on the armhole, I went ahead to design it by attaching a strip of chantilly lace. While attaching, I was also mindful of my half-inch sewing allowance. Now for the sleeve, I've gone ahead to sew the flay to the part that I cut out, and now I'll just attach it to the dress. So locating the midpoint of, notching the midpoint of the sleeve, and then locating the midpoint of the shoulder, I'll just go ahead and sew it down. Now after sewing the shoulder down, I will turn the dress over to the wrong side and then I'll just sew down both sides together to join my dress. Now this is the result and this is how my dress came out. As you all can see, it came out beautifully well. Actually, it's not my dress but for my clients. So if you like my video, please give it a thumbs up. If you want to see more of my videos, please subscribe. If you have a question, please leave it in the comment section. And I'm going to see you all in my next one. Thank you and bye.